Thank you, Allison. Thank you. That was just one example of the many, many, many sessions that our children and families receive at the clinic and the work that the staff does. Since our 7th building as one community and members of Jonathan's community, we need to bear witness to the reality of the struggle our children and families face, some of which require major interventions, and some of them merely require a deeper understanding. We together must consider the context in which behaviors occur for our children. Sometimes the cure is just listening really well. This is a call to engagement. We ask you to listen, to ask questions, to challenge the obvious conclusions, and look beyond what a situation may appear to be. With this in mind, and this message, we are so honored to present Dr. James Garbarino. Dr. Garbarino is the Clark Chair in Humanistic Psychology at Loyola University in Chicago. Dr. Garbarino is a prolific author and has a long-standing interest in the effects of violence-related issues on children. In 1991, he undertook missions for UNICEF to assess the impact of the Gulf War upon children in Kuwait and Iraq. He has also served as a scientific expert witness in criminal and civil cases involving issues of trauma, violence in children. He was deeply involved in understanding what happened in Columbine. He most recently completed a project dealing with children in the face of living in the face of terrorist threats. In several of his books, Dr. Barbarino writes about the power of the environment on the development of our children, the pervasiveness of negative influences, how bad things sometimes happen to really good families, and how parents and schools can teach children resiliency and social confidence. In a recent interview about how to treat children who have perpetrated violence, Garbarino said, yes, of course we must hold them accountable, but he also said, very succinctly and very clearly, we must love them. Dr. Garbarino.
Thank you very much. I'm going to have a relatively short time to talk with you, so I know many of you from New York, so I'll talk real fast and we'll have a problem. You can't do that when you get out to Nebraska. There's no good bagels either. So I'm glad they gave me this food here, which is very nice. I didn't know if it was because my daughter's getting married in 3 weeks, or somebody's going to invite me to the senior prom. I am available. Well, let me start by thanking all of you do-gooders for being here. Welcome, do-gooders. But I show you the respect of saying that when I talk with do-gooders, which I hope you'll allow me to be included in the ranks, I always want to start with this message that I saw on a bumper sticker, actually. It's on somebody's wall, a colleague's wall. Because I thought it really captured the need to go beyond simply good intentions. The bumper sticker says, you can change the world, ... But unless you know what you're doing, please don't. And the older I get, the more I appreciate the wisdom of this. Naive good intentions, in the face of the complexities that we encounter, really are not enough. Among other things, we need to move away from the idea that there is a simple formula or algorithm towards a sort of deeper, broader understanding that can inform every decision we make. I think about when Michelangelo, the great artist, was asked how he went about sculpting. And what he eventually said, after he fumbled around a bit, was, well, suppose I'm asked to look at it, pick up my chisel and my hammer, and I chip away everything that doesn't look like an angel. And I like that one too, because it suggests that it's a guiding concept, a guiding understanding, rather than specifying in advance a precise set of techniques. Technique is important, but this deeper perspective is probably even more important. The dynamic relationship between trauma and resilience, both words that appear very prominently in the program description, for the Pierce Clinic. Now, trauma is a term that, certainly in my professional lifetime, has increased its salience tremendously. I don't know if we can stop that from working. Maybe all the technological expertise is working on repairing the Hubble telescope today. And certainly, say, within my professional lifetime, trauma has become well, let's try that. And the reason for that, I think, is a growing understanding that trauma is really one of those fundamental core issues that once you begin to see through that lens or that perspective, you see a lot of things that otherwise don't do. I've certainly talked with elderly pediatricians who say, you know, I had a big practice in the 50s. I saw thousands and thousands of children and they never saw a child abuse case. You know, how was that possible?
She's not here yet.
You know, in 1955, an article in the journal Child Welfare attempted to estimate the rate of child sexual abuse. And the researchers looked at all the available evidence. In 1955, they came up with a rough estimate of somewhere between 1 in a million and 1 in 7 million. And of course, you look back at it and say, how could they have been so blind? Well, it's easy to look back and be perceptive, but the point is that we've come to see that trauma is one of the underlying issues in human development. That so many issues and problems which at first seem disparate and unconnected often can be linked back to traumatic experience. Both individual and cultural, individual and collective. And of course, America being a very individualistic country, we tend to emphasize the individual dimensions of trauma. Here's a traumatized child. Here's a traumatized parent. But in the long run, at least of equal importance, is the impact of collective trauma. I was talking before the talk with somebody from works representing a Native American indigenous community. If you have that kind of interest, you have to read this book, 1491. It's a book about North America before the European invasion. And what you will probably be astounded by is to take into account what it must have meant that within a generation, within a lifetime, about 90% of the indigenous population died and disappeared. It's not surprising then that in the indigenous peoples, themes of loss are central to their cultural identity, just as they are to African Americans who have centuries of traumatic loss, which is not just their individual experience, but is part of their very cultural fiber. And as we understand trauma better, these cultural effects, these collective effects come into sharper focus. I had a graduate student once who did a project on the theme of loss in the Iroquois. And they had organized their own culture around it. I mean, we know in the case of Jewish people the effect of the Holocaust in shaping Jewish identity in the state of Israel. But in terms of the percentage lost, the Holocaust is small potatoes compared to what happened in North America. That out of some 100 million people, 90 million died within a generation. So trauma is so central to so many things we deal with, whether it's politically or culturally or individually or clinically. Now, trauma, of course, has many definitions. Some of them are sort of evocative, almost poetic. One of my favorites is coming face to face with human vulnerability in the natural world, or to the capacity for evil in human nature. This captures, I think, so much of what it's about. The idea that these are experiences that profoundly transform your understanding of social reality, your understanding of physical reality. This is why tornadoes can be traumatic. This is why exposure to violence can be traumatic. To understand what is really possible. A more technical definition is it's the simultaneous experience of overwhelming negative arousal and overwhelming negative cognitions. That is the experience simultaneously of feeling like your emotional circuits are blown, that you can't manage the feelings that you have, that are so intense and threatening, and simultaneously that the idea that this is happening is more than you can incorporate into your thinking, into your mindset, into your concepts of the world. Now, some researchers have said that it's important to see it as a simultaneous experience of both. That simply the experience of the arousal or simply the experience of knowing about terrible things doesn't produce trauma. It's the coupling of the two. So, I could tell you the story of when I went to Cambodia and visited some of the killing fields, and seeing it in a spot not much bigger than this, where thousands and thousands of people have been slaughtered. They're not being slaughtered today. I'm not hearing and smelling them, but I know it. And in the center of the killing field is a monument. It's a tower of skulls, arranged by age and gender. Birth to 2-year-old boy skulls, birth to 2-year-old girl skulls, 5-year-old boy skulls, and it's 4 stories tall. But I don't worry about traumatizing you with that knowledge, because it also requires that you have the sensory experience of it to unfortunately be traumatized. So trauma is certainly central to what we're interested in, because it's run so clearly through so many of the problems that children present. But obviously it's not the whole story. The other half of the equation is something, as I said, that appears in Beer's literature, resilience. Now you'd think resilience was a simple thing, but once the academics would get in charge of any concept, it becomes more and more complicated, less and less clear what it is. And there's a whole literature on debates and counter-debates about resilience. Most people take it to mean somehow the ability to overcome adversity. And some people say it's not being affected by adversity, or not being affected as much as other people by adversity. But we don't have time to really get into that here. But the point is that standing up against trauma is the fact that human beings are not wimps. That human beings evolved in the face of traumatic conditions. That there were predators of all kinds that human beings had to deal with. There was so much loss, there was death, there was accidents, there were fires, and human beings, in order to survive, developed a variety of capacities to be resilient in the face of trauma. Now, there are many kinds of resilience. There's sort of psychosocial resilience, which is what most people think of. This is that ability to remain sort of psychologically intact in the face of trauma. Once when I was on national television a long time ago, I was asked to sort of give a quick definition in response to the question, what are the effects of trauma? And I said, well, there's sort of two possibilities. One is that you end up an emotional cripple in the sense that you can't function. But the other is that you end up with a sort of emotional limp in the sense that you can function in the major roles, but your functioning is limited or impaired by the weight that you carry around. Now, it's interesting, this was on one of my earlier appearances on Oprah before I got blacklisted from Oprah. And the audience had been selected. Maybe if we have time, I'll tell you how I got that. The audience was selected to be people who self-selected themselves as being victims of emotional abuse. And when I gave them this distinction between being an emotional cripple and being emotionally limping, they nodded their heads in unison. So I thought this must connect somehow with the actual experience of people. Some of you are old enough to remember Jolly Kay, who was one of the co-founder of Parents Anonymous. I knew her a bit. She was a woman who had been traumatized and abused and sort of rose above it to create this organization. But she did carry a lot of serious baggage, and eventually she ended her own life because she just couldn't carry the baggage. Traumatized people may produce amazing achievements and accomplishments, but it doesn't come free. Now there's, in addition to psychosocial resilience, there's moral resilience. The ability to transcend the impulse for revenge and self-interest and violence when you've experienced trauma. Years ago, I was in a Palestinian refugee camp. It was right around Martin Luther King's birthday. And I was talking with a little girl about, the Israeli occupation and how she responded. And she told me how the soldiers would come into the camps at night looking for people. And I asked if she was afraid. And she said, no. She was 9 years old, so she was much too old to be afraid. But she admitted that her younger brothers and sisters were. And I said, what do you do? And I said, well, I comfort them. And I said, how do you comfort them? And she said, I explained to my younger brothers and sisters that these soldiers are coming into our homes and breaking down doors because they're under orders. But when they go home, good fathers, loving fathers to their own children. It was sort of a remarkable demonstration in very short supply in the Middle East of someone who had this sort of moral resilience, that you resist the temptation to simply succumb to simple hatred as a way of maintaining your own psychological integrity. Now there's also what you might call spiritual resilience. The ability to face up to trauma and make a choice, a sort of pro-life choice in a sense, to live well, to connect with the larger positive forces in the universe. And without this spiritual resilience, even functional individuals facing trauma can be pretty nasty to witness and pretty sad to witness. As you heard, some of what I do is as an expert witness in murder trials, usually death penalty cases, where the alternative is death penalty or life in prison. In one case, a young man, 19-year-old boy, was given life in prison, and he said, "I'm going to kill myself." And I asked him why, and he said, quote, "Because I'm never going to the mall again." That he had accepted this narrow, shallow, materialist view of life, that you are what you drive, what you have, what you own, what you wear, that now that he was going to be in prison, there was no life for him because he didn't have access to this material life he had. You know, if people are sent to prison, particularly for life, they face a fundamental choice between becoming a barbarian, a savage, or becoming a monk or a nun. This is the basic choice you have. And this boy was headed down the route to savagery. But I have met some who have elected to become monks instead, who have used their confinement and the ending of their outside material life as an opportunity to develop a spiritual life. It's beautiful to behold, no matter how rare it is. So these are three kinds of resilience. How do kids get them? Well, again, this is a very individualistic culture, and we often tend to see things in terms of individual traits, personality, characteristics, and often this role of context is supporting people are. I was testifying once in a case in Denver, and in the cross-examination, after I had presented how the accumulation of risk factors, the abuse, the trauma, the violence, the deprivation, the racism, abandonment, laws, all these issues were weighing on this boy and needed to be taken into account to make sense of what he did, not to excuse him, but to comprehend him. And in the cross-examination, the prosecutor said, "Yes, Dr. Garbarino, but what about resilience?" His exact words were, quote, "What's wrong with this boy that he isn't resilient?" And I was sort of taken aback, because instead of using resilience to celebrate overcoming, he was using the succumbing as a lack of this trait of resilience. And I sort of had this realization, it wouldn't be long before there'll be a new diagnostic category of children diagnosed with resilience deficiency disorder. They'll be labeled RDD. And some kids will have that, and they'll have attention deficit disorder, so they'll have RDD and ADD. And then they can be diagnosed with yet another syndrome, excessive alphabet syndrome. Too many letters after your name. Some of us professionals have the positive version of that. Too many letters after your name. Well, the point, of course, is that resilience needs to be understood in context. And we have a growing body of research that helps us see what that context is. For example, we've come to understand that resilience is not an absolute trait. It is a sort of statement about the situation, sort of intellectually compassionate approach. And I say intellectually compassionate in the sense that the Dalai Lama speaks about compassion, not as an emotional response, but as a sort of intellectual conviction that you stand in favor of the other and their well-being regardless of what the other has done. It's easy to be in favor of the other when they behave well. What would really take sort of spiritual discipline and intellectual tenaciousness is to be in favor of the other when they behave badly. So here's two studies that help do that. One comes from World War II. It's a study done commissioned by a general in World War II who asked the question, if regular soldiers went into combat and stayed in combat consistently for 60 days, what percent of them became psychiatric casualties? And this was something that happened a lot in the last year of World War II. And the answer when we analyzed the data was after 60 days, 98% of the soldiers became psychiatric casualties. Now, most of them recovered. Some of them recovered to short-term rational therapy. Others it took longer. Some of them never recovered. It's getting harder to do, but you can still go to veterans hospitals and find very elderly veterans who were psychiatric casualties in World War II who never recovered. But 98%. I mean, can you imagine, after 59 days in combat, saying to a soldier, what's wrong with you that you aren't resilient? Particularly because when they looked at the 2% who didn't break down, the general thought, now certainly these would be the most robust, healthy, well-adjusted young American men, and they all turned out to be psychopaths. Psychopaths don't break down in combat. They allow combat. Authorized, sanctioned killing, the ability to witness suffering and torment. I'd rather go back to combat than go to Disney World. Well, Patrick Tolan and Nancy Barrett of Chicago did what I think of as sort of the domestic equivalent of that study. They asked, what percent of kids break down if you pile enough risk on them? And the way that they measured breaking down was that either their mental health broke down to the point at which they needed professional psychological assistance, or their academic development broke down to the point at which they needed remedial special education. So it's one breakdown or another. And they asked, what percent breakdown if you look at kids who are abused, because we know abuse is one of the primal traumas. 2, they live in the most violent and impoverished neighborhoods in Chicago. And at this time, that was a pretty powerful statement. Back when this study was done, Chicago was in a state where if you walk into a classroom of 15-year-olds and say, how many of you witnessed a homicide, it would be 1 out of 3. Whereas in the general American population, it's something like 1 in 100. So this was collective, widespread trauma. 3, he said, let's look at these kids between the ages of 13 and 15, because this is the period when what has been building up in childhood comes to fruition in adolescence. And kids are more and more sort of paroled from intense adult supervision at home and in school and paroled into the shark-infested waters of peer culture in the community and the neighborhood. Now understand, we talk about community a lot. We got community-based this, and a sense of community, respect for community, but rarely do we take it seriously as an analytic concept. So think about this. Studies show that children who've developed a chronic pattern of aggression, bad behavior, acting out, and violating the rights of others, children who could be diagnosed with conduct disorder if you're of such event, that we know that about 30% of those children overall will end up with serious violent delinquencies. But if you know the neighborhood that child comes from, the prediction is much more precise, because in some neighborhoods it's not 30%, but 60%. In other neighborhoods it's not 30%, but 15%. So the same pattern of behavior in an 8-year-old has a 4 times greater likelihood of leading to serious violent delinquency in neighborhood A than it does in neighborhood B. So it's important that this study looks at the neighborhood they lived in, the level of violence and economic deprivation. 13 to 15 is the time when this really starts to come to appear. The 4th thing they looked at was boys, because boys are more prone to breakdown than girls in many ways. Some of it is cultural. The fact that boys have to carry around the weight of thinking it's better to be mad than to be sad. The fact they have to carry around the weight that says to be a man is to be strong. But there's also presumably a biological dimension to this. After all, human biology is a part of human development. For example, you may have seen the work by Ashley Caspi and Terry Moffat, looking at a particular gene, the MAOA gene, a gene that controls the level of monoamine oxidase, a neurotransmitter that influences your processing of arousal. And the simple version is that the gene is either turned on or turned off. They found that when the gene was turned off, unless you have a lower than average level, and the child is abused, about 85% develop conduct disorder. When the gene is turned on and you're abused, it was only about 42%. So here's a biological genetic factor which doubles the risk that if you're abused, you'll develop conduct disorder. But more to the point is the fact that if you're not abused, the gene becomes irrelevant. That the level of conduct disorder was low and equally low, whether the gene is turned on or turned off, if you're not abused. There's always these social contexts that bring to fruition underlying genetic and biological predispositions. And the reason I mention it in this context is this gene is located on the X chromosome, which means that if you're a girl, If you have this gene turned off on one X chromosome, you've got another X chromosome where it's probably turned on. And so girls typically don't get this. But if you're a boy and you have it turned off on your X chromosome, all you've got is your pathetic little Y chromosome. Remember, the X chromosome's got about 5,000 gene types. The Y chromosome's got 25. So half of us start out 4,975 genes short. You can even see this under a microscope. The X chromosome is a big, robust, xenomorph chromosome. And the Y chromosome is sort of a little pathetic Woody Allen chromosome. As my mentor used to say, the Y chromosome won't do much for you, but at least it'll make a man out of you. So the point is, here's a biological phenomenon that would predict that more boys, when exposed to abuse, will end up with conduct disorder and violence. So that figures into Toland's equation. And the fifth thing was exposure to racism. And much as we would like to think, after we got Obama in the White House, racism is over. We would like to think that, but of course we know it's not true. Just a few years ago, a study asked African Americans and whites, how often does your race come into your mind as something that will affect what happens to you? And among whites, it was 3% who said often. Among African Americans, I think it was nearly 70% who said pretty much every day. Now, I was chairing a panel of teenagers a number of years ago, and somebody in the audience asked the kids to talk about their relationship to the police. And this wonderful 17-year-old African American boy stood up. He said, well, let me tell you my story. He said, first you need to know, he said, that I'm president of the Honor Society in my high school, and I have been accepted to an Ivy League institution next year. He says, nonetheless, since I turned 15, I have been stopped and searched on the street by the police 6 times. He said, I don't think it's because I'm president of the Honor Society. And then he said something I thought was really insightful. He said, you're lucky I'm a nice person. Meaning, you're lucky that this is the only risk I'm carrying around. I'm smart, I'm attractive, I got a good family, I got good parents, I got a future ahead of me. So I don't like it, but I'll carry this weight. But imagine if you don't have any of those things, how heavily that weighs. So Toland found when he had all 5 of those risk factors, the question was, what percent of the kids were so resilient they didn't either have mental health problems or academic problems? And the answer was 0. That every kid took a hit. Now, this doesn't mean we just say, oh, poor things, It means that we understand the weight that they're carrying, and we find ways to challenge them to achieve in that context. People often say about kids like this, why can't they participate more fully in the program? My thought is, how do they get up in the morning and get there? How do they get their shoes on? Maybe that's why the shoelaces usually run down. Getting the shoes on is about the first step. But you start there and you move forward. So the point is that resilience has to be looked at in context. And something else about resilience I think is worth noting. If you look at some of the research on resilience, for example, the research of Emmy Werner, she's German, so she would be Emmy Werner, she identifies a list of characteristics of resilience. And people often miss a couple of important things about it. One, her research is based on the nicest place on earth to be a poor, high-risk kid. It's based on a whole generation of kids growing up in the island of Kauai in Hawaii. Anybody else been to the island of Kauai in Hawaii? Let me tell you, if I'm going to be a high-risk kid, I want to go to Hawaii. I was telling somebody before, that 2 years ago, I was deciding, was I just going to pack it all in or start a new job? And well, my alternative new job was to work on a whale watching boat in Hawaii. And there were days when I think that would have been the right choice. But she reports, Emmy, that of her cohort of kids growing up in higher situations on the island of Kauai, by middle age, virtually all of them are basically intact and functional. And I kept thinking, the island of Kauai versus the south side of Chicago. Because we know on the south side of Chicago, by the time middle age, a substantial proportion of those people are dead. They're physically disabled because they've been shot or stabbed. They're in prison. So context has an awful lot to do with it. The other important thing about Warren is, if you look at some of the things that she points to, independence from family, that resilient children find a way to distance themselves from their family in order to not be sucked into it. I visited a family once with a public health nurse in the Bronx, and the place was a disaster. Except one child who had a particular talent as a track star had created a little corner of order and achievement in that apartment. And all the track medals and rewards were there. But she had done it by distancing herself from her family. Another thing that Amy reports is independence from culture. She reports, for example, that androgyny, the combining of traditionally male and traditionally female traits in the same person, is one of the predictors of resilience. Well, that is a kind of distancing from the sex typing that is normal within your culture. It's independence again. Independence of circumstances. Maybe you know the Search Institute, which has developed a list of 40 developmental assets. You know, these are things in families, in schools, in communities, in your head. And on average, the more of these assets you have, the less likely you are to have problems. For example, when it comes to violence, among kids who have 31 to 40 of these assets, only 6% have a problem with violence. Among kids with 0 to 10 of these psychosocial assets, 0 to 10, it's 61%. But the really interesting question is, how does the 39% with no assets still resist the temptation to become violent? How do they become independent of what you would predict they would be like, given what their life objectively looks like? So I mention this because one of the themes of resilience is it doesn't come free. That functional resilience may come at the cost of social connection, psychological connection, cultural integration. It may require you to stand outside all of these, what we think of as supportive elements, in order to preserve yourself in the face of a culture of family, community, neighborhood, which is high risk. And that, there's a sort of sadness to that. And it's a sort of injustice that would require kids to go so far from, in a sense, rejecting what most of us would take as our birthright, to feel connected and part of our family, to feel integrated into our culture, to feel connected with our neighbors. You know, the research on neighborhoods finds that the worst combination for children are neighborhoods that are sort of antisocial in their tenor and highly social connected. That if you're in a highly negative environment, the more adaptive strategy is to be detached and distant from your neighbors, the people in your neighborhood, and not let your child play with the other children, not associate because they will drag you down. So resilience is a very, very complicated concept. And the more we know, the better we can be at helping kids find a way to resilience, but also helping them to achieve this sort of connection. Maybe it's with us, maybe it's with art, maybe it's with music, maybe it's with some other cultural reality. Maybe it's finding, sort of going back in their cultural history to the pre-traumatic period to give them a sense that their culture is more than a traumatized culture, but has genuine, authentic, positive roots. You have to go back a couple hundred years. So when push comes to shove, I think that we need to understand that trauma and resilience exist in this dynamic relationship. And the more we know about that, the better we can, in the lives of individual children and individual communities, find a way to bring our good intentions to fruition. To understand that in addition to not focusing on psychosocial resilience, we need to focus on moral resilience and spiritual resilience as well. That perhaps ultimately the biggest resource against trauma is to be bathed in meaning, to be so embedded in a positive, meaningful sense that you can rise above the vicissitudes of a traumatic life, but not at the cost of your soul. Thank you.